Hello, DragonCon video production volunteers. This is Mauricio, your director. I am now going to give you a quick overview of the Canon XA35 camera that we're going to be using for segment production. So this is going to be rented from MMI, as you can see by that yellow sticker on the side. This camera costs about $2,100, so please do handle with care. The first thing I'm going to do is give you a quick walk around of the camera so that you understand the layout, and then we'll get to operating it. So as you can see by my hands here, it's not a big camera, not a small camera, and you can hand hold it, but we're going to be using monopods, and I'll talk about that later. So the most obvious thing you're going to need is the screen here. You open it like that, you can tilt the screen, and we'll get to see what's on the screen in a little bit. While I have this panel open, the memory cards go here. There is a little door that you have to open and close. So the camera won't work unless that door is closed, so make sure that door is closed. We're going to be using only slot A, which is the one on the left, so make sure you put the memory card in there. This uses SD cards, so here is one of the memory cards. I'm just going to stick that in there. It locks in place. I close the door, and so forth. So otherwise, you're not really going to need to be using any of the buttons over here. You will have to use these two buttons. I'll talk about them later. So let's walk around the back here. This is the viewfinder, which you can also use. It pulls out and tilts up if you need. Generally, you're not going to need to use this. Maybe if you're outside in bright light and the screen doesn't work very well for you, you can put your eye on that. This is where the battery goes. There's a little switch here that pops it out. So we have two different kinds of batteries, this smaller one and then a sort of a longer one that maybe goes out about that far, that runs a little bit longer. Now I guess I'll say this now, these are aftermarket batteries. These are not official Canon batteries because they're cheaper, I guess. However, when you see the battery time left on the screen, it's not going to be 100% accurate. It may, you may turn it on and it says, oh, you've got 90 minutes, and then maybe 2 minutes later it's going to say you got 15 minutes or something like that. So just keep an eye on that, and I'll talk a little bit more about that meter when we get to the operation of the camera. So this is a switch that controls what the ring does at the front, this ring right here. You're probably not going to use that, but if for whatever reason you want to use that for zooming or focus, you can use this button, the switch, to control it. But again, you're probably not going to use this. This is the all-important record button. Please remember to press this to start recording and press it to stop recording. And then this is a little joystick that will control the menus. So you'll see that there's a menu system on the screen, and instead of using the touch screen and tapping around, you can use this joystick to control it. This is the zoom rocker. So this is the main way you're going to zoom in and out. There is a second zoom rocker here on this handle. So this is going to be set to be the faster zoom. So if you want to zoom in and out quickly for whatever reason, use this one, and this one's going to be set slower. As I've mentioned before, you probably do not want to be zooming during, especially when somebody is speaking, when you're interviewing somebody, and otherwise, use this carefully. It can be kind of distracting unless you have it planned out in advance. So this is where you would plug in the power, but we're going to be running off of battery the whole time, and we're going to have separate chargers, so you should not have to use this. This is where you can handhold it, like so, but like I said, we're probably going to have this on a monopod, so you might not need to use this handle so much. Over here is a little cover that comes off and reveals some other ports. The only one you need to be concerned about here is right there. That is the headphone jack, right? So you're going to unplug in your headphones there when you're using the camera, right? This is how you monitor audio levels. Make sure you have headphones. Please bring your headphones. We'll have a spare pair if needed, but I know some people are particular about their headphones, so we would like you to bring your own if you can. And we'll have a little label printer if you want to put your name on it, just in case they get misplaced, and so we know who they belong to. So that is what that little door does. Over the front, we have the all-important lens. However, this has a lens cover. So if you don't see anything through the screen, that probably means that that thing is closed, and there is a little switch here that opens it up, like so. Okay, open, close, open, close. Okay, you can leave it open all the time if you want. It's not a big deal. This will generally, if there's any kind of impact, this hood will generally cover it. You can take the hood off, but we want to leave the hood on, basically. Unless you have some very specific reason to take the hood off, please do leave it on. It's something that could get lost, and then we have to replace it. So up here is where the tally lamp is going to be. So when it's recording, there will be a little red light there. When the battery is low, if you, the camera operator, doesn't notice it blinking on the screen, this will actually start blinking here, and so the talent or whoever you're pointing at might mention, oh, that thing's blinking really fast and angry. What's going on? That means the battery is low, so you might want to tell your talent actually to watch out for that, in case you don't notice it on the screen. You probably will, but just in case. So there is a little, on this background to this side, there's a little button and a wheel here that we're going to use for exposure compensation. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a little bit. So this is a handle that can be removed, but we are not removing it. It needs to stay on. This is where all of the XLR audio controls and the inputs are. So if you wanted to, you could take this handle off and not have XLR, and it's sort of a smaller form factor, but we're going to be using XLR mics for everything. So, and this is where they plug in. So these are the XLR inputs. This is input 1, and this is input 2, as they are labeled as such. There's a little release lever here that you can use to plug things in and out. I am not sure whether we will have these shotgun mics on it, on the camera. If not, we're going to use the internal microphone for channel 2. But for the talent microphone, in other words, the one you're going to be using for the most part, it's going to be here on input 1. And I'm going to pull that out now and show you what that looks like. So first of all, there's going to be a flag here, official DragonCon flag. That needs to go on the microphone. The microphone itself will look something like this, with this foam cover on it. You put the flag on the base of it, kind of push it up here. There's going to be a little bit of room for the talent to hold. You want to advise the talent to sort of hold it up here and not where it's plugged in, because you don't want to jostle this. It can get some handling noise otherwise. So make sure this is pushed up pretty high to do that. And then we're going to give you a big long cable. This is what the microphone end looks like, and that just, you see those 3 pins there, that just plugs in like so, and it locks in. You need to push this to pull it out. On the other end is where it goes in the camera. This, again, there are 3 pins here and 3 holes. Line that up, and then it'll lock in. So I'm going to do that like so. Okay, and that's now locked in. So to remove this, I would need to pull on it while pressing this up. So I will do that now. And there it goes, it comes off. I want to give one word of caution when you're using this particular microphone, if you need to plug it or unplug it, and that has to do with phantom power. So this particular, the shotgun microphone that we're using, if we're going to have one on here, requires power. So that's 48 volts that comes out of this port. This microphone, the handheld microphone, is not. This does not require power. Now the way you apply power is with these switches here. So you'll notice that this is referring to input 1 and this is referring to input 2. This is currently set to plus 48 volts, which means it's getting power. This one is set to not get power. If we have a shotgun mic, chances are it'll just stay on there. You just leave that set to 48 volts. If you need to remove that microphone for whatever reason, you either need to make sure the camera is off when you're doing it or make sure this is switched to the center. Okay? We do not want power applied to the microphone while it's being plugged in and out. That could cause problems. That could damage the microphone. So make sure that either the camera is off or this thing is switched to mic. I prefer actually that you have the camera off because you might forget to switch that back on. Mic 48 volts there. Again, do not set 48 volts for input 1 because the microphones we're using do not need phantom power. While I'm looking at these controls, I will tell you some more about it. So this on-off switch controls whether you're using the internal microphone or this handle, right? So basically it's saying use the handle or don't use the handle. You're going to want to leave that on. So this controls how the audio volume is handled by the camera. So this is auto and manual. I would recommend leaving this on auto. If you're in a situation where for some reason auto is behaving badly, and you'll be able to tell when you're listening through the headphones, then you're going to want to switch it to manual And then this knob here will actually control the volume level, right? It's not going to try to compensate for loud or soft. It'll just be a single volume. Auto will try to adjust the volume, possibly as somebody is speaking. It usually works pretty well. But again, if it's not working for whatever reason, please use that. If you are, I don't anticipate this, but just in case, but if you're in a situation that is very loud, like a concert, we're not really supposed to be recording music at concerts, but if you find yourself in a loud situation like that, there is a feature on, unfortunately it's on a menu called attenuation, and you can set attenuation, which will essentially drop the levels by 12 or 20 dB on a particular channel. That's if it's coming in too hot no matter what you do. Again, you probably won't need that. I'm just mentioning it now just in case. So that's how audio is controlled. Let me again show the top of the handle. There is this zoom rocker that is going to be the slow. As I say, this will be set to be slower. And there is also a record button here. So in theory, you could hold it by the handle, and then, like if you're doing a low shot and it's not on the monopod, you can hold it by the handle, sort of tilt the screen up, and you're looking down on the camera, and then you can use this button to start and stop recording. This is a lever which locks it so that you can't accidentally press it. Chances are you're not actually accidentally going to press it, but if you need this button and it's not moving, it means that this thing is locked. So just open that up, and then you can just press it. Now let me show you how the monopod is attached. There is a tripod mounting point right here. So the monopod will have a plate on it. This might not be exactly the monopod we use, but this is a good example. So it's going to have a plate on it here that needs to be removed before you can stick the camera on it. There's a lever here that releases the plate. If for whatever reason the lever does not release the plate, it means that there might be a locking pin that needs to be opened up. So just flip this out, for example, and then the plate will come off. So that opens up. This lever will stay open. The plate comes off. So what you're going to do with this plate is stick it on the bottom of the camera. Hopefully this is obvious, but just in case. This screw lines up with the hole. And then you twist this until it is fairly tight. You don't want to overdo it. You don't want to overcrank it, but fairly tight. Once you have that, this will then go back onto the tripod, or monopod in this case, and if you want, you can lock this back down. And now that's going to be pretty darn stable. You can hold it, hold the camera actually just by this foam grip on the monopod. When you want to remove it, again, flip, hold the camera when you're doing this, please. Open this switch, and there it comes. We may be leaving the monopod plate on the camera full time. You want to check this, make sure that the plate is either on there or not on there, and that the monopod also does or does not have the appropriate plate. Something else I wanted to show you is how we're going to attach an LED light. We're going to give each camera, will have a light that looks like this or something similar to this. It's going to take either regular batteries or a camera battery. There is going to be a switch here to turn it on. And there you go. And you can dial this up or down. You're going to want to, as the camera operator, decide how bright this needs to be to get proper exposure. There's usually a little button on the back that tells you how much power that has. If it's running low on batteries, you're going to want to possibly swap them out. You're going to want to also make sure the bag has a set of spare batteries for, of course, the camera. There will be at least one spare battery for the camera, but also spare batteries for this light. This light gets mounted on this shoe on the camera. So it's going to go something like this. It slides in. There's a little screw here that tightens it, so make sure it's loose before you put it in. You slide it in, and then you can tighten this down. Now, you will notice that if we have this shotgun mic, the light gets pretty darn close to the mic. It's actually sort of pushing down on the foam. That's okay. If it does much more than that, then it depends on the light, depends on the shotgun mic, then we might have to remove the mic and use the internal audio for this. And we'll figure that out on site. But just be aware of that. You don't want you don't want the light to be pushing down too hard on this. So that's how the light works. You can tilt the light, and at least for this one, you can loosen this knob and it'll tilt up and down, but usually you don't have to do that. So now I'm going to show you how to reverse that. I'm just going to loosen that and pull it off. Last, I want to talk about the charger and charging. So there will be, it's not necessarily going to be exactly like this, but there will be a charger This says XA25, but it's the same type of battery, XA35, XA25, same type of battery, over in Linux. So when you're done with your shift, make sure you pop a battery back in here so that the next person using the camera has something ready to go. And also, if the camera bag does not have the battery, it could be in the charger, so check for it there. So we are not going to be, as I said earlier, we're not going to be plugging the camera in directly to power. We're going to be running off of batteries because we're in a run and gun scenario. Now we're going to talk about operating the camera, and for this I have brought out Nibbler the Nibblonian to assist. So how does this work? First, you're going to want to open the screen. You're going to spend most of your time looking at this screen. The power switch, the all-important power switch, is here. If you flip it to the right, it'll go to the playback mode where you can view previous clips. More important is to switch it to the left, which is camera. You'll see this green light comes on. If that green light does not come on, it means the battery is dead. The screen will come on. This takes a few seconds for it to get to the point where you can start using it. So don't expect it to turn on and be shooting absolutely immediately. So that's how you turn it on. Before I get to the screen, I just want to point out another switch over here. This, do not touch this switch, basically, or you should not need to. This sets auto mode, cinema mode, or manual mode. We're going to be using manual mode. If you find out that there's some things you cannot do for whatever reason, that it's not behaving the way you would expect, it may be on auto or cinema, so make sure it's on manual and leave it there. Even though it's manual mode, it's actually not that manual. It's some features or functions are still automated. So let's talk about what's going on here. I'm going to show you what's on the screen. I'm going to sort of walk around it. First, there is this is the mode that it's in. This is the program mode. It should stay on there unless you have special reason to do otherwise. This is how you enable go to the menu system. So if I tap that, again, this is a touchscreen. You'll see a bunch of options. For example, here's the program mode and another things. Again, you probably don't need to change any of this. If you need to get to the menu to control more detailed settings, that you can tap menu after. Once you're in that function screen, you can then go to this menu. There's a few pages of options. Again, you shouldn't need, I've set this up so you shouldn't need to do much with it, but if if something goes wrong and you want to poke around there, you can. Just be careful what you change, or try not to change anything really. Up here is the clip timer. This will start counting up as soon as you record, so I'm going to do that right now so you can see it. So I'm going to press the record button. Again, it's on the right side of the camera, and you're going to see it start counting up. So, and you'll also see, of course, the red dot, and you'll also see the red tally lamp on the front when it's recording. So that's going to count how long you've been shooting. So one thing that's a little bit annoying about this camera relative to one of its predecessors is that it does not reset for every clip. So even though it started at 0, it's going to now start at 16 seconds and then count up from there. So if you want to know how long your current clip is, that's kind of important. Like I said earlier, we want to keep relatively short clips. You're going to need to know where it started and then say add 10 seconds, right? Okay, it started at 16. I want about a 10-second clip. Let me just stop it near 26 or something like that. Or you can count 1 1000, 2 1000 in your head. Unfortunately, there's no way to have it reset after every clip. There is a way to manually reset it, but you have to go into the menus, and it's really just not worth it. So, going around the rest of the screen, this indicates the image stabilization is active. I think you'll always see that there, so don't have to worry about that. This is the battery meter. So, as I mentioned earlier, this since these are aftermarket batteries, this may behave a little bit strangely. Basically, once this thing starts turning yellow or red, you should probably be swapping the battery. If you're in the middle of an interview, go ahead and finish it, but be aware that it might die during the interview, and you might have to start over or do the previous question over again. So please do keep an eye on that. This tells you how much space is left on the memory card. We're going to have pretty large memory cards. You can see this has 5 hours, and you're not going to be filling up the memory card on a shoot. So you shouldn't have to worry too much about that. But if that starts turning yellow and red, that means you're about out of space. Again, that should not happen, but keep an eye on it just in case. This is the recording mode. We are recording at 30p, 24 megabits to MP4 files. Again, that doesn't need to change or anything. Unfortunately, it'll just be there and you'll have to look at it, but you don't need to be changing that. Let me show you what happens, by the way, if the memory door is open. So if the door is open, it will, first of all, tell you that the memory, it'll tell you that the memory card, effectively, the memory card is not there. That's what that red is. This is the same thing as if I pop out the memory card. It basically doesn't know. It does not even pay attention to that slot until the door is closed. So now it says that it's there and it tells you how much time is left. Over here in the bottom right are your audio meters. Let me take a moment to tell you what you're seeing here. So there's input 1 and input 2. Right now I don't have a microphone plugged in, which is why you don't see any levels on input 1, and that's fine because, again, I don't have a microphone. I do have that shotgun microphone plugged into input 2, and you'll see that as I'm speaking, the levels are going up. When you're checking audio levels, you want this to not really go above 10, okay, or below, depending on how you look at it. You don't want it to go past the 10, at least not very much. This is about the sweet spot for the audio levels. Also, when you have the headphones on, I've set this up so that it will only tell you what's coming out of input 1. In other words, your left and right, even though it's a single channel, it's duplicating input 1 to your left and right ear. I don't want you to think that you're recording proper audio when you're listening to either that shotgun mic or the internal. That's sort of a backup or natural sound, right? You don't want to depend on that. You don't need to really be monitoring that. Don't worry about it. That's just a backup. We want you to pay attention to input 1, which is why the headphones will only output what you hear from input 1. That's the way I'm setting it up on these cameras. Over here is telling you that the peaking and zebra are enabled. And I'll tell you, you can sort of see some weird stuff on the screen. That's the peaking and zebra. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. This is just saying that face detection is enabled. It's not really detecting Nibbler's face here, but that is for focus. So if it detects a human face, it will try to focus on that by default. This is telling you that autofocus is enabled. Instant autofocus is what that stands for. And you can turn that on and off with this button, which I will talk about again in a little bit. So that's a quick overview of what you're going to see on the screen for the most part. Now I'm going to talk about a few things that you have to keep in mind when you're shooting and how the camera is going to help you with those things. So first of all is framing. You'll notice that there is this rule of thirds grid on the screen. If you don't know what the rule of thirds is, go ahead and look it up. But the idea is that you, especially if you're going to be interviewing somebody, you might want to have the subject on the left on that left line and the subject on the right line. So let me just zoom in on Nibbler here. So this might be a sort of a portrait shot of Nibbler. You want to leave relatively little headroom. Now he has an eyeball on his head, so let's just say that that's about how much headroom you want to give him if that was if the eyeball's top of his head. But if we want to use the actual top of his head, then maybe like this, just a little bit off the top when you have somebody sort of taking up the screen. And of course, you can zoom this out a bit and tilt it down and so forth. You have since it's a monopod, you'll be able to move it relatively freely. You just sort of tilt the whole thing forward or back. So that's how this grid will help you with framing your shot. Next, I want to talk about exposure. So you'll notice that I've enabled a feature here called Zebra, which shows you what 70% of brightness is, where that is on the screen. So you'll notice that that weird wavy, diagonal wavy pattern is at 70% of brightness, and that way you aren't fooled by the natural light around you, or you might not be able to trust the screen, the colors you see on the screen, but you can trust the zebra value. So that is 70% brightness. So let me zoom in here on Nibbler. You want that 70% on sort of light skin to sort of land on that skin. So you'll see that by default the camera is exposing Nibbler properly. So you can see that on the light part of his skin, the zebra is on that. So the camera is performing auto exposure in this P mode. So that, for the most part, will be handled for you. Now there are exceptions. So what I'm going to do now is open the blinds behind Nibbler and show you a more challenging situation. Okay, now you can see there's a problem. Nibbler here is backlit, and the camera is sort of confused by this. It's trying to get the trying to measure exposure off the whole frame, and it's making him too dark. We don't really care about the background here. Generally, you won't. So the way to mitigate this is something called exposure compensation, and that is controlled by this button and wheel near the bottom of the camera. So let me show you where that is. So down here is this button. When you press this button, it will lock the exposure and enable this wheel, which lets you tell the camera, no, make the whole thing brighter or make it darker than you think it should be. That's why it's called exposure compensation. So I'm going to do that now. I'm going to press the button, and you'll notice that there is, in the corner, under the P, there is a little plus minus icon and then a plus minus 0. That tells you now that the exposure is locked. No matter where I point the camera, it will not adjust the exposure. Okay? Now, this is actually pretty handy for, frankly, any shot. Once you set up the shot, it's a pretty good idea to just turn on the exposure lock so that the exposure does not change during the shot. It generally looks a little bit unprofessional when exposure changes during a shot. Sometimes you have to let it do that, like if you're pointing at the ground and then panning up to the sky, you have to let it calculate it on its own because and adjust it, because otherwise it would look very strange. But sometimes if you're interviewing somebody, you don't want it to change during the shot. Like if they turn on some light on their costume, it might look a little bit unprofessional if it changes because of that. So you might want to lock it. It's not required or anything like that, but might be a good idea. However, in this situation where you want to enable exposure compensation, then you're going to want to do that. Obviously, press the button, and then I can turn this wheel here, and it's going to say plus or minus. So if I turn it, in this case, clockwise, as I see it, I'm brightening up the whole image, and now you can see that Nibbler's lighter skin is properly exposed because you can see the zebra on it. That's how you know that it's correct. That's why you want the zebra. You'll notice that the background is blown out as a result, and that's okay. We don't care about the background in this case. We want the subject to be properly exposed. And you can also do the reverse. If for some reason something is too bright, you can bring it down. You can go below. So that's a negative exposure compensation. In general, though, you want to set up the shot so that this does not happen. You don't want to be interviewing people against a bright background, for example. If you can't avoid it, then fine, you can use this exposure compensation. So again, it's this little button here on the bottom and this wheel. Turning it this way, again, this is counterclockwise from this direction, but from the operator's direction, it's clockwise. So you turn it this way to lighten the exposure, and you turn it this way to bring it down. And then to turn it off, you just press the button again, and then it goes back to auto exposure. So I've closed the blinds again now, so we get sort of more normal exposure. Before I finish talking about exposure, I want to mention that we are not needing to control aperture gain or shutter speed. That is normally how you manually control exposure, but I found that with this camera, the P mode handles that reasonably well, and that saves you some trouble when you're shooting, especially in a run-and-gun scenario. But if you did need to change those for some reason, if something was getting really weird, I'll just show you where it is. So if you tap on the rec programs, go to the function, rec programs, you'll see here that there's some options at the bottom. TV is its time. This is the shutter speed. So there is where you would tell the camera, you know what, I want to take control of shutter speed. Okay. In general, you do not want to go below 1/30th of a second. You want it 1/30th or 1/60th. But again, you probably shouldn't need to touch that. So if you go to aperture, AV, aperture mode, this is where you can actually manually set the aperture. Again, this is opening and closing the iris on the camera. You probably don't need to do this. There's not any really depth of field tricks that we're going to be doing for DragonCon. But if for whatever reason you need to control it, that's where it is. And you'll notice now that it says AV over there, and it's telling you what the f-stop is. But again, we're going to go back to the P mode over here. And then the camera does do some gain, which adds digital noise. So in dark lighting, you might get some noise. In the past, these cameras have been pretty crummy with low lighting. This particular model is rather decent with it. Again, you're going to be having your LED light with you. You shouldn't be in a scenario where the noise, the digital noise, is terrible. But this is where that could be controlled or limited. So 24 dB is what it's set to now, maximum, but it could be, you could make it so that it doesn't go quite that high. But again, we should not need to touch that. We're going to let the camera decide what gain it needs, and in general, I think it's going to look pretty good. So that's how on a professional camera or even DSLR, or at some point and shoot cameras, is how you would control exposure manually with those three things: the aperture, the shutter speed, and the gain. But again, we're going to let the camera handle that for the most part, which should make your job a lot easier. Now we're going to talk about the all-important focus. So what you're going to notice is that there are some red edges around parts of the image that are in focus, basically where the camera has detected high contrast. You should be able to see this here. What I've done is temporarily disable zebra, so that's should be a little bit more clear here. And that's what that peaking is. It's colored red. There are other color options, but I've chosen to use red here. And so you should see around Nibbler's silhouette and his eyes that there's these red edges. And that tells you, as the camera operator, that yes, this is in focus. You don't have to sort of guess whether it's in focus. You can tell for sure that the camera thinks that that is in focus. Again, areas of high contrast. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to point the camera away and get it out of focus so you see what happens. So now you can see that Nibbler is clearly out of focus, but you don't even have to look at the screen or what it looks like on the screen exactly to be sure. You just notice that there's no red edges anymore, right? So that's how you can tell that clearly tell that it's out of focus. Now, what I've done here is turned it to manual focus to force it, but by default it will be in autofocus. Let me turn that on by pressing this button over here, and you'll see that the camera does acquire the focus pretty fast and pretty accurately, especially if there's a human face. It'll track that pretty well. So that's generally, when you want to set up focus, what you're going to do is make sure that it is on autofocus. Now, you could leave it on autofocus, but what happens in some scenarios is that the camera will hunt for focus. And so while you're doing the shot, let's say it's an interview, it may accidentally focus on something that it isn't supposed to, maybe something in the background. And that looks like, essentially focus hunting is what that's called. The whole image shifts, and obviously things go in and out of focus during the shot. In general, this is not a desirable thing, and to avoid that, you can, of course, once you've set up the focus, let the camera find the focus for you. You can turn it off. So now it's a static shot. You're interviewing somebody, and you're going to be holding that shot for, maybe 5 minutes, and then you can just leave it on manual focus and be assured that, first of all, that it's going to be in focus because nobody's really moving back and forth, and second of all, that it's not going to change focus on you. The autofocus is off. The issue with doing that, of course, is to remember to turn it back on and get it back into focus when you do the next shot. One thing about this camera and other cameras, like these running gun cameras, is that they generally don't have much of a shallow depth of field. It's fairly deep, meaning things tend to be in focus. So you may look at the screen and say, it's close enough, it's in focus, not realizing that you've left it on manual and that it's slightly out of focus. So again, I would, when you're preparing your shots, getting ready for these static shots, check for the peaking, the red marks, and also check to see whether that's on auto or manual focus. Now, if you are actually moving, like let's say you're walking in the parade or something, then go ahead and leave it on autofocus. There's going to be too much motion for you to try to manually adjust focus while that shot is happening. So go ahead and leave it on auto. It generally is pretty good. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is white balance. So what I've done here is deliberately shifted the white balance on this scene so that it's obviously very cool. It's a little too blue. And this can happen even with the auto white balance of the camera. There are some situations where it can be fooled. For example, you can have your LED light on the camera, but the ballroom you're in might have tungsten lighting. So you have this combination of cool lighting and warm lighting, and you end up with this sort of weird cast to everything, which may or may not be apparent on the screen. Usually it is. This is, again, an extreme case that I've set up for you. And in that situation, the camera may get confused. So what you're going to need to do is, if the auto white balance is not working for you, is to manually set the white balance. And the way this is done is relatively simple. We're going to give you, each segment crew should have a piece of paper like this, laminated piece of paper, that's to get people to wave at the camera. And on the back, of course, is nothing. So you can actually use this as a white card for doing white balance. And the way that works is go to the white balance menu. What I've done is set this button 2 to be the white balance menu. Pick one of the bottom 2 settings, 1 or 2, doesn't really matter, and then point it at that white piece of paper, or really any white piece of paper is fine, and tap Set White Balance. And what it'll do, the camera will adjust the white balance so that that thing that you say is supposed to be white shows up as white. Having done that with this lighting environment, right, so this is obviously you want to hold that near your subject. Maybe have the person you're interviewing the talent hold it up to his or her face, so that way that the lighting on the talent is the same as the lighting on the card. So having done that now, you'll see that the white balance on Nibbler here looks more correct. And the way that you'll know that that it's using that white balance is over here on the screen. You'll see that it's using setting number 1. If you see that, that means that it's using some preset white balance. There's more than one. There are other presets, but that's the one that you chose to set. If you don't see anything there, that means that it's on auto white balance, which is sort of the default. So I'm going to go back to that menu. So you see there's a bunch of different presets. There's sunny, there's shady, there's cloudy, there's fluorescent, there's tungsten. You can even set the Kelvin temperature of the white balance, and there's these 2 presets. It is only on these 2 presets where you can actually set the white balance with the card. So I'm going to set this back to auto white balance, and you'll find, for this scene at least, it's having no problem with this. It's getting the white balance properly. What you may want to do if you feel like you've had some experience with it and you feel comfortable doing it, is to set the white balance for every scene regardless, so that way that the camera will not change the white balance during the scene. This is something that's less of an issue in practice, unlike the exposure or focus. It's less likely that the camera will change the white balance during a shot, but it can happen, and the way to ensure that does not happen is by not being on auto white balance and picking a proper preset. I'm not saying you have to do that, because it's easy to forget to turn it back on, and you may forget to do it for a particular shot. And also, it is one of the few things that we can sort of fix in post. Color casts on a scene we can sort of fix in post. If it's out of focus, if it's very badly exposed, there's not a lot we can do about that. So just keep that in mind. But for white balance, if it doesn't come up correct for some reason, we might be able to compensate for it in post. And that's it. Thanks for watching. Contact me on Slack or email, or leave a comment on this video if you have any comments or questions.